All right, welcome back, everyone, to the House Committee on Government Operations and Military Affairs. We're here this morning to pick up with testimony on S42, the divestment bill. And I want to welcome Katie Green. Could you introduce yourself for the record and tell us what your position is, and then we'll hear testimony. Thanks.
Great. So Katie Green, thank you for having me today. I'm the Deputy CIO of the Vermont Pension Investment Commission. And I'm here today to present on the engagement efforts of the Commission to combat climate change within the portfolio as a risk factor. I'll be referencing the slide deck that was provided, so move right into it. So first, I just want to take a moment on page 2 slide here, just recognizing that we see this as climate change as a significant threat. It's catastrophic. And it's pervasive throughout the portfolio. It's not just fossil fuel companies. It's also the auto industry. If you're buying real estate in Miami, you're considering sea levels. We consider these factors to be equal to financial factors when we're evaluating investments throughout the portfolio. So how do we do this? How do we give it the time and address this factor, this risk? So the VPIC has accountability, transparency, and resources. This is slide number 3. Accountability, oversight. The VPIC has created an ESG committee, and they are accountable for all of VPIC's ESG policies as well as engagement activities. And they report up to the Commission.
Representative Waters-Evans.
Thank you. What is ESG?
Oh, so it's environmental, social, and governance. So these are environmental would be climate change as well as other factors. Social would be the human condition. So whether it's slave labor in the supply chain or it's other issues we engage on our diversity of the board because they make better decisions when they're more diverse, less groupthink. Or governance issues that the executives are paid on the same share earnings per share as shareholders. So engaging our governance structure, if you will. So those are the 3 different factors, and they often overlap. So when you're talking about climate change, we often talk about governance structure. So board diversity feeds into oversight of climate change in a reasonable way. They make better decisions. So one is not exclusive of the other.
Thank you.
The other piece is transparency. We have tremendous disclosure, or we're trying to do our best to meet all of the needs of everybody that's out there asking us questions. Morningstar noted that VPIC's disclosures and voting rationales were exemplary for our proxy voting record. We don't just say we voted yes or no. We say if we voted against management, we give the rationale why, which is important to those seeking more clarity on why VPIC is voting the way we do. We also have a sustainability report where we talk about all the different efforts that VPIC is making, both through engagement, proxy voting, and other efforts, whether it's engaging regulators or companies directly, and also our proxy voting record. And then resources. VPIC is unique that they have actually hired Siegel Marco, a consultant, to help us engage efficiently and effectively. We're a small staff of 3. So in order to do more, we hire a consultant to help us. They help us connect with experts. So when we go meet with companies, which we're not meeting with middle management, we're meeting with the secretary of the board, we're meeting with their experts, their scientists, and their management leadership. So we need the experts at the table. I am not an oil and gas expert. When I meet with them on flaring, I make sure that I have either a nonprofit or a university professor or somebody at the table that understands and speaks the same language so we can come to agreements that are efficient and meaningful. So often I just wanted to set a foundation here. Most of you are probably familiar with the Paris Agreement. But I just wanted to set the foundation for this. The Paris Agreement is an internationally legally binding agreement that went into effect in 2016. And what it says, it's a global goal. So everybody's moving in the same direction. We might have companies or countries that pledge more or less, but on average, this is the goal we need to meet to combat climate change. And what it says is that we need emissions globally to be reduced by 45% from 2010 levels by 2030. And reach net zero by 2050. The global energy mix will still likely have fossil fuels in the mix, but they'll be offset to net zero. So we won't be emitting more into the atmosphere to warm the earth. And why this is important on slide 5, we outlined that it's scientifically based and it's measurable. We want to make sure that everybody's held accountable and we're all going in the same direction. What you might say, well, what does that actually mean? If we were to just do a linear line, what do we need to be doing to keep the world at 1.5 degrees? You need to reduce emissions by 1.4 gigatons of carbon annually. This equates to, just for those that are like me and we're not scientists, the effects of COVID in 2020 was a 1.4 reduction in gigatons of emissions. So we would need to, if we kept our fossil fuel consumption the same, we would need to stay home, not fly, be isolated. That had the same effect. But and also it gives us a timeline. So 2022 emission levels, we have 9 years before the world warms to 1.5 degrees Celsius above where we were. We have 18 years to 1.7 and 30 years to 2 degrees. And I just wanted to point out, Senator Clarkson asked me to add this, and I think it's wonderful because it shows Vermont is moving towards net zero as well. They have their own goal. It's set here. And we just wanted to recognize that we are part of the solution as well. And it's a big ask, right, to move towards the Paris Agreement. You can see this chart on the right. The current warming level is at 1.2 as of 2021. The Paris Agreement at 1.5 is that blue line right above it. And the pledges and targets get us to the gray line, which is 2.1. So we're not there yet. And our current policies put us at 2.7. So we still have more to go, which seems like a daunting task. But right now, today is a really exciting time because we've seen tremendous velocity in policy change. So in the US alone, they passed the IIJA, which was a bipartisan deal, as well as the Inflation Reduction Act in 2022, which is about $480 billion into infrastructure upgrades, decarbonization, and energy efficiency to mitigate climate change. The IRA is especially interesting because it's tax credits, which are directly investable by institutional investors like VPEC. So we can take advantage of that, and there's a value add to it. This means that you get private industry into all moving towards that global goal as well, and they see it as profitable. It makes those renewables and other decarbonizing effects more cost efficient and competitive. There's other notes here on the EU. And other continents that are also considering similar plans to the IRA. And I would note that it's important that the whole world is moving in the same direction because we benefit from that. These managers that are investing our money, they are not just beholden to US investors, they're global. So they're beholden to European investors, Asian investors. And if we all are moving this way, they have to go to the highest standard. So those disclosures are available. If they're EU regulated, then they're available to US investors as well. So that makes it more transparent, and then they can value things more easily. So this is on slide 8. Just wanted to show you where the world is today. It's kind of a grim picture. The majority of the energy consumption is focused on fossil fuels. You'll see traditional biomass, that's burning of traditionally wood, if you will, as well as other issues, which is renewable but not green. So we have a ways to go. And you can see the largest emitters, China, US, EU, and India, as well as the rest of the world. So what do we do? How do we move this forward? Well, companies institutional investors like VPIC need to hold these companies in our portfolio and invest in them so they transition. And you might say, oh, we're only $6 billion. How do we even do this? Well, we provide the capital and then we engage with the companies and we hold them accountable. So companies say they're going to set these targets. Well, we say we want interim targets. We want short term, medium term. We don't want to get to 2050 and then act like we're shocked they didn't get there. We want to make sure they're hitting these targets and they're held accountable. And there's disclosure in between. So every year they're telling us how their path is moving forward, as well as board level oversight. We need that throat to shake if they're not getting there. We want to point to somebody and say, why aren't you meeting these goals? And that's where engagement matters. They listen to you if you're a shareholder because you're an owner in their company. And when one other piece to this is when we bring a proxy resolution, we only have $6 billion. And we only have 70 basis points, so 0.7% in fossil fuel industries in the public market exposure of the BPEC. So about $300,000 worth of these companies. So why would they listen to us? And that goes into my next slide. We don't go to the table as just BPEC. We create coalitions of investors. For environmental issues, we're Climate Action 100 plus. They have 700 global investors and it's $68 trillion in assets. We target 166 companies who collectively account for 80% of global greenhouse gas emissions. So when I go meet with Southern or Devon, I'm not going to the table as just Vermont. I'm going to the table as Climate Action 100 with $68 trillion of assets under management behind me. And I'm often there with some of even our managers like PIMCO or the Bank of England, their investment committee. So it's not just Vermont that's battling this. We have partners that care as much as we do to be at the table. And when we file a resolution, it goes to every shareholder, no matter how they view the world, we're informing them. And when you talk about things like flaring emissions, where we care because it's going up into the atmosphere and it's dollars just being thrown at, because that is money. There's a price to be paid for flaring. And by reducing that, we're increasing shareholder value, which all shareholders want, and reducing emissions of that company. So that resonates with everybody, and they're willing to vote in favor of our resolutions that set targets to reduce emissions that way. So that's how we approach this. We see it as a value add, and all shareholders can get on board. And management has to act when shareholders vote. So when they vote and they say 47%, not even a majority, they'll bring us back to the table and say, how can we meet the ask of your resolution? Our shareholders care. So we're moving forward and reducing climate change exposure in the portfolio by holding companies accountable. If you divest, you have no say, you're not at the table. And I know everybody's heard Treasurer Pierce talk about this for decades, but you can be a squeaky wheel. We can hold very little of these companies and still engage with them and have a really big impact on climate change. So successes of Climate Action 100 in the last 5 years, 75% of the companies engaged have made net zero commitments that are in line, either as good or better than the global goal. So 75% of those 166 companies have pledged net zero. And by continuing to engage with them, we ask for short-term and medium-term targets along with this long-term goal. Because a lot of them are saying, well, we'll make this pledge, but we don't know how we're going to get there. That's not good enough. We can't just say, on a wish and a hope and a dream that we're going to get there in 2050. These companies need to have a plan and they need to be taking action on it and disclosing their actions. 92% have board level oversight of climate change risks. So that's important because when we go to them, we want them to be knowledgeable about climate change and the risks associated with it. We don't want them to say, oh, we didn't know about that. We want experts on the board. And we want to make sure that they're having those discussions, that it's on the agenda. And then 91% have reported, according to what we call TCFD, which is climate-related disclosures. And why that's important is you may have heard about the SEC requiring climate disclosure by companies. Well, 91% of these companies are already doing those disclosures, so it's not a big lift. So once the SEC passes that into law or into regulation, then these companies can move it forward and it won't take years. It'll already be available to investors like ourselves, so we can value them accordingly. So just another slide on page 11, 40% of the 2,000 largest public companies. So these aren't just fossil fuel companies or the largest emitters. These are just the largest 2,000 public companies. 40% have committed to net zero emissions. So these are airlines, apparel companies, within the supply chain, they're exposed to fossil fuels. So it's important that we're engaging everybody in this discussion. Countries as well. We talked about Vermont's goals. Well, other countries are also pledging net zero, and you can see that that number is much higher. But in 2019, there was this very big trajectory upward. So there's momentum behind this movement. It's really exciting time. I know in 2013, when we started this discussion, there wasn't a lot to talk about. There was a lot of, you'd go to the table and doors slammed in your face. Well, today, everybody's talking about this and everybody's pledging, whether it's political pressure or not. And you see this anti-ESG, companies are still willing to move because their shareholders want to add value. And that's what drives them. It's the wallet. So just another piece, I wanted to outline the steps to, we talk about these climate action plans, the short-term, intermediate-term targets, how they get there. They invest in low carbon technology, which is coming online, a lot of private market exposure. Even in our portfolio, we'll talk about clean tech. That's because we need new technology to get to net zero. So to move this forward, we need more than what we have today, and we need to be investing in those through private, whether it's private equity venture funds or it's through credit funds. That's where these smaller companies that are coming online, that's where you'll see that exposure in our portfolio in the private markets. We need to retire inefficient infrastructure. VPIC last year committed $20 million to a net zero infrastructure fund to transition the infrastructure globally. Because what we have in place isn't efficient enough to support electrification of the world and acquire sustainable energy resources. You'll see like Hess, and I know it sounds like greenwashing, but their CEO said, we want to become the most profitable renewable energy company in the next 10 years. They have so much cash and they are most incentivized to be able to transition. They don't want to be a stranded asset. They don't want to be left in the dust. They want to make sure they're profitable for the long run, and so they're investing in these things. Just as another shocking fact, Texas has the largest exposure in the U.S. to wind projects. So if you think about those pieces, well, there's a lot of headlines about these companies and Texas. They are investing in these because they see the profitability. They see it's advantageous and they're cost competitive in coming online with improvements in technology. The last slide is just a case study. I can walk through it if it'd be helpful on how we engage with a company and how that directly lowers emissions within our portfolio. But I want to be mindful of your time and others you have coming in. I can also take any questions, and I would leave with 2 points if there's no questions.
Folks have questions for Ms. Green? Representative.
Thank you for coming today.
Absolutely.
I asked this question, or the treasurer talked about it as well, and it sounds like these disclosures for the carbon footprint of a company, you're saying some of them are doing now voluntarily, but eventually it'll be mandatory, is that correct?
That's the hope, is that the SEC will put it into regulation. It's very close to the end. We anticipate probably by year end that rule will go in, will become actionable. And what it means for us is that will be standardized, so it'll be readily available. Right now, it's really costly, and we have to do it only through our managers, where they're linking all these different sources and standardizing them to one level. It would be incredibly costly for us to do it alone. But the SEC would be requiring them to do it in a standardized format. And we have the technology already in place that once that goes through and that information is available and reliable, we can then measure our footprint better.
Another subject, when you're talking about you have some influence with whatever company you're investing in, I just Googled up Exxon in regards to their commitment. It looked like initially it was $15 billion to lower greenhouse gas emissions in 6 years, and they upped that to $17 billion. So again, if you do have investments in that, you're saying that you kind of hold their feet to the fire in regards to that timeline. I know it's only 6 years, but again, you're looking at maybe a different timeline to make sure that they're meeting that with that kind of money?
Absolutely. So when we are engaging and requiring them to meet targets, it might seem like greenwashing on their part, but targets are incredibly important to companies throughout the last, since we've been investing. If they set a financial target, if they miss it, it's direct reduction in their shareholder value. You'll see their shares slump. So nobody wants to miss targets. That's why it's been so hard to get them to set targets or make pledges. But now you're seeing this tremendous velocity where we have a very conscious consumer behavior as well. They want to see it. Investors want to see it. and we're squeaky and we're badgers. We are loud. We are not, we might hold very little of the company directly, but we have others that hold more. And some of them don't necessarily want to be at the table, so they're happy to let us do it. So yes, we hold their feet to the fire to those pledges, and we make them disclose it, which means they're public. So you'll see headlines. If they miss a target, it'll be on the Wall Street Journal, and then you'll see their share price go down. So these are really important measures that we hold them accountable. And like I said, we, on our public markets, we hold approximately 0.70%, so 70 basis points. So 99.3% of the portfolio is not direct fossil fuel exposure. But all companies have exposure in their supply chain to fossil fuels. And that's what we're trying to talk to them about. It's much easier to move a consumer company than a consumer-facing company because the headline risk is much higher for them. But it's still important to engage with the fossil fuel companies because they're best poised to invest in the technologies. So one of the engagements we did this year, we engaged 4 companies on direct methane measurement because they were finding that the way the EPA requires their disclosure, it's an estimate, and it was off by considerable amount in some studies. And so we started engaging these companies and asking them to disclose on their efforts, as well as joining a nonprofit that's encouraging them to collaborate so that technology comes online for direct measurement. And that has shareholder support because methane emissions are direct dollars into the atmosphere and lowers our share price. So they're really receptive to this. And they don't want it to go to a shareholder vote. They don't want their shareholders to be aware that they're lagging in this space. They don't want us presenting at their annual general meeting on the fact that they are not directly measuring methane and that it is an estimate. It's educating the populace that's holding those shares. And then we move with our feet. I mean, we can either leave and walk away from the table, or we can make them make these pledges. And they know that those are the decisions. So divestment is a tool that we will use if they aren't willing to move and it's not as profitable. Our managers will not hold them. And that's why we push so much disclosure, because our managers value those companies with the information they have at hand.
Thanks a lot for that.
Yeah, you bet.
Any other questions for Ms. Green at this point? Okay. Anyway, we have a couple of other witnesses on the.
And I would just, points, if you will. One, if you pass the divestment bill, we will be doing less for climate change in the portfolio. We will not be mitigating those risks as efficiently because we won't be at the table. We won't be a squeaky wheel. We will not be setting pledges for companies to reduce emissions, and we won't be seeing that reduction. So we might not be holding them. But as I said, fossil fuels are pervasive in the entire portfolio. It's not just fossil fuel companies, it's others as well. So we need them to be making these disclosures and we need to be holding them accountable to their pledges. And the second thing, and I wrote it down because it's legal, it's a legal piece, but if this bill passes, we would ask that you include the language that was provided to you by the chair from the external legal consultant, Robert Klausner. Texas and California included it, but it protects fiduciaries and staff like myself from claims, whether justified or not, of either breach of fiduciary duty or a violation of the Uniform Prudent Investor Act, because you can't do both. But as a professional staff of the VPIC, I would ask for that protection because I don't want to be liable. I don't want it to be a financial hardship on my family if I was to be sued. So I'd ask that you consider including that in the bill. And that's very important to me.
Representative Waters Evans.
Thank you. I was going to say I have a quick question, but it might not be.
Yeah, sure.
But I'm in trying to understand all this. Is there a path that you could see that would involve divesting slowly over a longer period of time while remaining investing in all these companies are part of that Climate 100 thing? Like, I guess I'm asking, is there a medium? Is there a longer term plan? Is there a possibility to make both happen at the same time?
Absolutely. I mean, for me, if I were in your shoes, I would require a study. It would be 6 months. By January, we could come to you with a plan. It would likely include partial, divesting over time. But we need help to create that climate action plan. Other states are doing this. Other funds are doing this. And it would be, they could also evaluate the risk to participants and value those as well. So you'd have all the information and it would be actionable. So that would be my hope, to do a study so that we know the best path forward using these tools, but doing it in the most effective way, because divesting of them might not be the most efficient way to mitigate climate risk. We need help in studying that. And it only takes 6 months. We're not asking for a year. We're asking for 6 months to do the RFP, get the study done, and bring it back to you. So that would be my recommendation, so that you have all the facts, but staff at 3 can't do that. We need external help from consultants and our actuary.
Anything else you want to leave us with?
No. Thank you so much. Appreciate your time.
All right, our next witness this morning is Tom Sanzillo. Are you still with us, Tom?
Yes.
Could you introduce yourself for the record?
Yeah. My name is Tom Sanzillo. I'm Director of Financial Analysis for the Institute for Energy, Economics, and Financial Analysis. We're an organization that's global, and we're energy and finance experts. And before I was involved in this, I spent 17 years in senior management positions at the city and state of New York, comptroller's office, including in the last 5 years. I was the first deputy comptroller, and in both instances, senior management on all the pension funds, investments, as well as the shareholder engagement. And we've been engaged in, we've been asked by a number of the nonprofit organizations in the state to help assess this. And so we've had some discussions with Tom Galanka and treasurer. And so they asked me to come back because of the discussions. So I would like to take a few minutes just to go through what we see in this, because we've been involved with divestments all over the world at this point, and it's an interesting experience that I think can be brought to bear here. There have been a lot of opposing points made about the SB 42 bill, and I've been involved in putting it together, and some of the commentary I don't understand, because I believe a lot of what the criticisms being made have already been are already in the bill. But I'll go through that in a minute. There's five major criticisms. One is that you'll lose money if you divest. Second is you'll eliminate VPIC's ability to buy into index funds, that you'll eliminate them from investing in private equity, that you'll eliminate the shareholder engagement, and that you'll expose the board to liability. I disagree with every one of them. Every one of those objections. I think the bill adequately protects you, and this is why. Opponents in the to divestment keep saying that the fossil fuel industry is making money for your portfolio. That is not true. For the 10 years up to the point when Vladimir Putin invaded Ukraine, they were at or near last place in the stock market. And then for 2 years, those 2 years of the COVID return and what have you, and the invasion, the price of oil went up, and so did their stock value. Today, and since January 1st, they have been at or near last place in the stock market again, because the markets are coming back into form. I gave you a little picture in my testimony of a day-to-day kind of characterization of the market. They are at the bottom of the market. They are losing. They've lost money for a decade. Private equity and the indexes. Your advisors, I don't get, and I would challenge any one of them to explain to me how this is going. After the markets went up, they've now dropped back down to a sort of a modest level of about $80 a barrel. That's pretty high, and they're still not doing very well. That's where we were before Ukraine. when I'm told that we're maybe going to cost you money because of the private equity investments that you have, and the fund that I came from, we established private equity investments in the early 90s. And so I'm very familiar with how this works. McKinney's put out a report that said that the only industry where the private equity has not been gaining money and has not been gaining in the number of deals in the last 5 years is the oil and gas sector. So you're losing money in your indexes and you're losing money in your private equity things. So, and the faltering state of this industry is very clear why. Some of the things that Kay just mentioned. Never before has this industry faced electric vehicles. Never before has it faced wind and solar energy. And never before has it faced what's going on all over the world, except the US, which is a major rethink of the economy away from petrochemicals and plastics, and to reduce that. Those are the three major areas of the industry. Every single one of those areas they are losing market share in right now. That will continue. That's not going to stop. And then on the other level, we have an industry now where many of its leaders are political leaders for oil-dependent nations, and you know who I mean. And they are doing anything they can to keep the flow of oil and gas revenues coming into their countries, even at the expense of what's going on in Ukraine right now. But I'm just looking at the profit picture here. And and also in the coal sector, which I mentioned, they have lost 50% of their market in the United States since 2007, and the predictions are that they will probably go down even further. None of these industries are doing well. And I ran a pension fund at the time when the oil and gas industry were 28% of the stock market. Today, they are less than 5%, and before the Ukraine invasion, they were at 2% of the stock market. That is a complete turnaround. They are no longer the big contributor that they once were. And I got involved with them in private equity for a decade, and they were big big contributors to pension funds, mine, the state of New York, and every other pension funds. So what my organization really is looking at is we're looking to defend pension fund value and the value of the work, the retirees. We see this as a completely defensive move, that you should be looking at this industry as an industry that once performed well, no longer does, and that they are no longer in the best interest of your members, and that is your fundamental financial rationale. Now, some of the other questions have been raised that it moves you out of indexes. Well, right now you're invested in Champlain mid-cap index, which is a fossil-free fund, and it's doing well. In fact, it's doing better than your targets. So there are investment indexes, and in fact, over the last 10 years or so, you have indexes now that are Vanguard and Fidelity and BlackRock, much bigger investment houses capable of taking large amounts of capital, returning the kind of returns that we need to keep the pension fund solvent, and reducing emissions. Those products are on the market and they're ubiquitous. There are so many of them now that they're even rated by a couple of nonprofit organizations. And, so the indexes are there. We've seen 1,500 funds around the world divest to some degree, some more and some less. They have not lost money, according to BlackRock. In fact, no evidence of loss of money. You have professionals doing this, and now the market allows for these investments to take place, and they're not going to lose money. And they're not going to go above their fee structures. What BlackRock found when they looked at the the funds that had divested, is they found that the fee structures were within normal budgetary parameters. I have in my testimony a third example, the state of California, which has been moving towards a net zero policy. And what they show you in the example that I gave you is four funds, index funds that they assessed, and then a fifth fund that they sort of devised themselves. And they took a look at that, and they then moved $20 billion into one of the low carbon funds. That's a significant amount of money moving into it for three reasons: good returns, capable of handling a lot of money, big chunks of dollars, and they reduced emissions. You can't, anyone telling you these products are not there, this is evident. These are facts. The fund that I used to work for, the New York Common Retirement Fund, is in the middle of a divestment strategy right now. And they're taking it deliberately. They're doing the kind of plan that is in the bill already and that Katie mentioned, and I agree. You have to have a plan. You'd be fiduciarily irresponsible not to have one. So there are many examples of where there are funds, indexes that can be allowed. And then on the private equity side, you have entanglements for a couple of years with fossil fuels, and you should stick with them. And you should not because they're good investments, incidentally. And you might want to monitor that. You might want to go to your managers and say, you're invested in fossil fuels. How are they doing? Because they're not doing well. But what you can do is to say no new investments in them. And that can be done so that as these older investments, legacy investments roll off, and some may make money, but by and large, they're not making money. And you would then say, okay, no new money going in. And that's a gradual and procedurally and fiduciarily correct way to do this. The city of New York, 2 weeks ago, just announced that that's what they were doing. If you read the details in the state of Maine, that's what they're doing. So this is not evidence of you losing money. It's actually a defensive measure to protect you against losing any further money in the private equity markets. Besides their extraordinarily poor financial performance, they are also involved in what Katie was just describing, which are in our view, questionable ESG practices. And we make a very clear distinction between ESG considerations and financial investments. What I've been talking to you about is making the money necessary to pay the retirees. The ESG considerations are about the kinds of issues that Katie was talking about, which are essential and important to address. And they are very important, particularly outside the fossil fuel sector, for all the reasons that she gave. It's the fossil fuel sector where we see very little evidence of support for ESG. In fact, as somebody who's been involved in this for a very long time, I think 1990 was my first meeting with the oil and gas industry, is they act in bad faith. And if you want to see an example of it, when Tom DiNapoli from New York State announced his divestment plan, he went out of his way to say, I've led this industry, the ESG movement, for 10 years, and I'm done. I'm done because they're not acting in good faith. They are recalcitrant for the most part. And I mean Exxon, and I mean some of the other ones. And so you have to have the kind of good faith that Katie's talking about in order for these things to work. So you can have it work in Google and you can have it work in Amazon. Those companies have acted in pretty much in good faith. It's the oil and gas industry that have been a problem. And if you want to take a look at, I've also referenced something from the International Association of Insurance Superintendents, their view, and it's also been our view, that to run a shareholder engagement plan like Katie was talking about, if you do not have divestment in your toolkit, then the companies know you're not serious and they will not take you seriously unless, and it just think about a typical negotiation, because that's what this is. If you have a negotiation and the other side knows you have your hands tied behind your back, they're going to take you for a ride. And that's what the fossil fuel industry does when you take divestment off the table. That's not Tom Sanzello telling you. That's the insurance advisory supervisors of the world who are telling you that your program is ineffective if you don't have included in it divestment. not as your lead goal, not as your lead product, but as a way of dealing with recalcitrant companies. And the fossil fuel sector is a body of recalcitrant companies. The other couple of points I'll make, and then I'll stop, is in the bill, there is a 2% de minimis holdings that the VPIC staff wanted the right to maintain a 2% of the portfolio in fossil fuels past even the 2040 date that we had asked them to, to divest by. And I would go along with that. I don't know why you would want to hold these stocks that are not gaining money that long. But it does allow you to continue the engagement that Katie was mentioning. And if you think that that is valuable and you want to continue doing it, by all means, go ahead. And people giving them a hard time is not a bad idea. They're just not listening. And as I said, I'm really here to talk to you about defending your money. And your money is not good in those companies. And that's what I'm talking about. I don't care. I really don't care if you're at the table in a company that's losing money. That's just, and will continue to lose money. And that's what we're about. So anyway, and then finally, there's a concern, and I don't know this topic very well, so I'm not going to lead you. But when I heard that there was a concern over liability of staff, I was responsible for a staff of a few hundred in a pension fund, and that this is being raised. If you make a fiduciarily sound decision, and I believe these are, you don't have any worry. But if your advisors are telling you you do, then I would look pretty carefully at what your liability insurance is, not about divestment, but in general, and why there is this concern. A sound fiduciary judgment does not expose a staffer to this kind of to the kind of liability that's being entertained. And incidentally, the example of thermal coal in California, which was the bill, thermal coal, since they've divested, they will tell you they've made money by getting out of thermal investment. So that decision actually made money and wouldn't expose them to any liability at all. So anyway, our view is that the objections are substantially met in the bill. It's a divestment plan going forward. There's a plan to do exactly what Katie and the VPIC folks have been saying that needs to be done, that lays out how you can get out of these investments. You do it over time. You do it in a manner that doesn't cost you money. You do it in a manner that actually should make you equal or better off. And that's the kind of plan going forward that any fiduciary has to take before they can make these steps. This is not a request for you to higgledy-piggledy get out of fossil fuels tomorrow. That would be irresponsible. But this is a way to manage the legacy investments that you've made and to get out of them in a way that defends your asset values and defends the money in the fund, because the industry is not making money, and we can't see any way that it's going to continue doing that, continue to change that. Thanks.
Hey, Representative Hooper, go ahead.
Thank you for being here, Tom. That last point that you just made, the industry is not making money. At one point in time, Studebaker made wagons and people were all up in arms because the horses that pulled the wagons were leaving stuff in the middle of the street. Eventually, Studebaker changed their business plan to make automobiles. That same transition, I would assume, will happen with other corporations that want to survive. So, that's a little bit of crystal ball stuff that I don't know that we get into. Most of the indexes that you talk about that are fossil free, what's their basis point charge compared to other generalized funds?
You mean the fees?
Yeah.
Your fees, okay, yeah. Well, the way that we've seen the returns, and the best evidence that I have that is a third party objective report is BlackRock's report for the city of New York. And the way they described it, they looked at 14 different funds that had divested, and they looked at the fee structures. And what they found was that the fees were within the current budgetary parameters of the existing funds that divested. And then I would also point out to you that there have been 1,500 other examples of divestments around the world. And although I can't vouch for every one of them, I don't imagine that the fiduciaries of those funds would have agreed to massive, overpayments of fees. So the fact also is that these indexes that now exist, and I pointed out Fidelity and Vanguard and BlackRock, but you could go to JP Morgan, you can go to all of them. They all have these, and they are now competing with each other. So the fee structures are coming down, even as they are already within budgetary parameters. They will be competing with each other, because what your earlier 2017 report says is that increasingly the economy is going to be the markets are going to be resembling the very index and mix of companies that we're talking about now, and that's true. So the reason you have more and more and more of these indexes that are fossil free is because they are becoming more mainstream in the economy, and that the economies are all moving that way. So that's really what that is. So on the fees, I would say examine them as you should before getting into any of them. I would suggest that you call the state of New York, call the California people, because that one example that I gave you of the 4 funds that they did, that they reviewed the fee structures, and they found the 4 that they selected, the reason in the end that they chose, it was a low carbon fund, a Paris compliant fund, a decarbonization fund, and a fossil free fund. And they reviewed all of them. And there was one that the staff put together. And they reviewed them and they said, well, they all meet our return targets. They are all within the fee structures that were okay. And we're going to go with the one that reduces emissions the most. And understanding that the emissions numbers these days are not perfect because there's no uniform system of accounting as you would find with fees and others. So I would suggest you call around to those funds and find out what they're paying in today's market, if you want to take a look at it. But the outside research that we have is from BlackRock, and you should look at that study and then continue doing your own. But we're not seeing fee structures that would cause you exorbitant problems. Champlain, the one that you have, is a little high, but it's still within your budget parameters. And it is incidentally a fund that's making more money than your targets.
Yeah, so they're doing pretty well.
So
Coal dropped out of the index. Nobody did anything. Nobody divested from it. It just got returns that were so poor that index is dropping.
yeah, and unfortunately, so Representative Hooper, I really want to avoid us giving testimony, especially on this, and especially given your role with VPIC here. So I want to be careful that we're asking our witnesses questions about their expertise. Also, we have one more witness here, so I just wanted to make sure that we will have time for committee discussion on this bill. We just have another witness waiting. So in that context, do you see that happening with fossil fuel?
I didn't quite hear the first part of the question.
Same thing that happened with coal that got dropped.
Yeah. I had to do actually a presentation on this a couple of days ago to some investment folks, and the coal issue is quite different. But the trajectory is the same. The speed is going to be different. Coal is easily replaced in our economy. It had one real function. Well, it has 2 functions. One is for steel, and that's metallurgical coal, which is we're not talking about that. Thermal coal, which has been used for power plants, has been it's been on its way out for a while, but it really hit bottom, if you will, when the natural gas prices collapsed and fracking took off in the 2009 period. So they were losing out in the markets until then. And in other parts of the world, like in China and India, it's a much slower go for coal. because it is so important to the economy and what have you. Here, we've been able to replace it pretty regularly. Replacing automobiles, I mean, we the internal combustion engine with electric vehicles, I think you can see the speed of that. Darren Woods, the head of Exxon, has said that by 2040, he believes Exxon will no longer be refining gasoline, which I found quite amazing that he would say that. And then on the petrochemical world, where you're having the major market for the oil and gas industry, it's not as easy to replace fossil fuels, but it is taking place. There are processes going on in China and Europe with very different economies that are looking to create markets, regulatory rules, new financing structures to eliminate as much as possible the plastics, the fossil fuels and plastics. Our country is it's much slower, much more contentious, but the markets are moving in that direction. And so I would say to you, coal dropped by 50% in the US in 12 years. I think it's a little slower for fossil fuels, and that's to our, we take on a great risk by going slower.
Do you have a question, Representative?
I can wait. I can do it in the discussion.
Well, Tom, thank you for sharing your testimony with us today. I want to make sure we have time here before we break for our next witness. But
okay. Thank you. And thank you for doing this. And as a former public official, this is not an easy issue. And it's come to you as a legislative body, because this is not an issue that I believe in the end, having been a pension professional. I think the pension professionals and the financial analysts are not the ones to be making this decision. It's unfair to make you make the decision. I think it'd probably be better off at the federal level, but it falls to you. And as a former public official, I know that you don't choose the issues that you get to work on. But this is one where, because you're elected by the public, you have to make an all things considered judgment. It isn't right. It isn't fair, but you have to do it. And I don't think, as a former pension professional, that my profession is up to the task these days. It has to be, and we can achieve that goal if you give the right direction. Pension professionals can achieve the kind of goals that we're laying out in SB 42. But they have to be given the direction by the fiduciaries. And I believe you serve that function in this particular example. So thank you. And I'm sorry that you have this problem.
Thank you very much for acknowledging that. Okay, great. Well, so I want to make sure we have time for Mr. Crawford's testimony before we break. So Steve, would you like to take the witness chair, please?
And I promise we'll be out of here tonight. Thank you for having me. My name's Steve Crofter. I'm a retired Vermont public school teacher with a pension in the system that we're talking about. In preparing to be here today, I did go on the legislative website and read all your bios. And one of the things I noticed is that most of you mentioned that you have a spouse, and many of you mentioned children. And I imagine I might not even be the only grandparent in the room today. I'm guessing that love of family is one thing that we all have in common. And another thing I believe we have in common is our commitment to the future. I think the decision to be a teacher or to be a legislator is based on caring about the future and what will happen to those who come after us. One of the goals of this divestment bill is to preserve, as much as possible, a livable future for the people we love. So as you consider S42, I ask you to please keep your loved ones and their future in mind. So I'm one of the many Vermonters with a pension in the state retirement system who's been wanting for years to see fossil fuel divestment happen. For many years, VPIC and the former state treasurer have been claiming that divestment would be too costly. And I think a culture really developed in which it's assumed that divestment was unpopular among us retirees and pension holders. I have an acquaintance who's a retired Vermont State Police officer, and I asked him recently if he knew of any other Vermont State Police who were in favor of divestment. I was really saddened by his reply. He told me, yes, I know several, but I don't think it would be safe for them to speak up about it. Kind of a sad state of affairs to think that's the case in Vermont. But the culture now is changing. Our new state treasurer is in favor of divestment and is in favor of this bill. And VPIC has shown a real willingness to negotiate about this. It's all very hopeful to me. I'd like to address from my unprofessional perspective a couple of what I see as VPIC's main concerns. The idea that divestment is too costly and that the value of fossil fuels is too important to divest them. And actually, Tom Sanzillo beat me to the punch on some of this. I don't know if he's referring to the same report, but I saw a report that came out in February that tracked fossil fuel investments over the previous 10 years. So that included 1 year of the war in Iraq and the 9 years previous to that. And even though there wasn't a sort of an upswing in the value of the investments during the Iraq war, the downward trend was obvious over 10 years. So I agree with what Tom said. From what I can see, the value of fossil fuel investments is decreasing. One thing that's leading to those values decreasing is investment itself, as more and more municipalities, political entities, institutions divest, the value of those shares go down. And at this point, there's now more than $40 trillion have been committed to divestment, and that figure is growing every year. So, if Vermont jumps on this bandwagon, it's a good bandwagon to jump on from a financial standpoint. The other thing is that people are switching away from fossil fuel products, whether it's an electric car instead of an internal combustion engine, whatever it is, people are making choices because green energy is cheaper now than fossil fuel energy. And, that has to lead in the future to stranded assets and the decreasing value. And then finally, regulation by governments and litigation by governments and individuals is also increasing. Think about what happened to the tobacco industry as, they face more and more lawsuits. That's happening more and more with the fossil fuel industry, and that's going to drive their costs up and their value down. So for all those reasons, I think common sense tells us that the value of fossil fuels is going to continue to fall. And then I wanted to speak briefly about the shareholder engagement issue, whether that is more effective or less effective than divestment. VPIC has an excellent shareholder engagement program. Katie Green is impressive for what she's done. And I admire it, and I hope that VPIC will continue to use that in many situations. But I don't think that it's a sufficient strategy to use with the fossil fuel industry that's ruining life on Earth. It does occur to me that VPIC could continue to use shareholder engagement with fossil fuel companies within their 2% de minimis. And if I heard Katie Green's figure right, I didn't know this, but did she say that it was 0.7% of the entire portfolio is in fossil fuels? If that's the case, they could triple that amount and still be around the 2% de minimis. So they have plenty, and maybe I got that figure wrong, so don't quote me on that, but whatever it is within that 2% de minimis, they can do all the shareholder engagement they want, and I encourage them to do that. It's great. I would love to see that continue. But in general, if my house were on fire, I wouldn't negotiate. I would try and get out. And on a planetary basis, our communal house is on fire. And it's not a time to request concessions. It's a time to get out. We're in a climate emergency now, like a house fire. This is an emergency. Climate scientists agree that fossil fuels are the major cause of global warming. They also agree that we're in for major disruption of life as we know it. We are going to experience, at a minimum, increasingly catastrophic weather-related disasters, worldwide disruption of agriculture. And that doesn't mean a few farmers are going to lose their jobs. It means that people will starve. It means there's not going to be enough food for all of us to eat. There's going to be mass migration and to the least affected areas. And if Vermont is lucky enough to be a least affected area, I'm sure we're going to have lots of company here. Is it reasonable to think that 1 million people will move to Vermont? I think it might well be. There's going to be billions of people having to move. And I don't think that any border or any wall is going to be tall enough or strong enough to keep people out whose children are starving. And there's no food where they are. They're going to come where they can get a bite to eat, no matter what we think. There's going to be widespread loss of life. There already is widespread loss of life in many parts of the world. We haven't been hit by that yet here in Vermont. But even in the United States, there's a loss of life in these superstorms that we see. There's loss of life when Oregon and Washington, heat up to, well over 100 degrees. There's going to be likely breakdown of society. And unfortunately, it's too late for us to prevent those things from happening. But it is possible to make all of those things less horrific than they would otherwise be. To fully solve the climate emergency, if we wanted to take that on as a piece of legislation, and I'm not suggesting you do that today, but it's clear to me that we would need to recognize that perpetual growth is impossible on a finite planet. We would need to create a new economy that meets the needs of people instead of making profits for a few. And we would need to stop externalizing or disregarding the costs that we can get someone else to pay for or we can pay for later. And Chair McCarthy, you referred to this last week after Treasurer Pichek's testimony when you spoke about the social, environmental, and economic costs of inaction on the climate. So we can choose to sort of face the music now or we can sort of put it off. But as we put it off, the costs, the economic costs get greater, but the human heartache gets greater too. More life is lost, more people live in misery. So this divestment bill does not accomplish, ending the climate emergency. It does not accomplish rewriting our economy into an economy that really works for everyone, but it's an important step in the right direction. With this bill, we can stop investing our money in the exploration, expansion, and development of fossil fuels, further fossil fuel reserves. As well as making a material difference, this bill will also give people hope, and I urge you to support it. In closing, I want to share with you that I recently saw a posting on Facebook. A former student of mine posted a photo. I'd met Maria when she was in kindergarten in 1999, and now she's sharing pictures of her first wedding anniversary on Facebook. She didn't look pregnant in the photo, and there was no comment mentioning a child. And I couldn't help wondering how climate change affects family planning in her generation. It was sobering to realize that Maria might have to might have to consider whether it's kind to even bring a child into the world when there's so much heartache in store for all humanity as we collectively continue on the path to making our planet uninhabitable. When I receive my pension check each month from the state of Vermont, for which I'm grateful, it comes with the knowledge that part of that money is tainted sullied by its investment in the very industry that's destroying our only home. Passing this divestment bill would allow me to reconcile my use of my pension money with the caring that I still feel toward Maria and the many other students that I taught all those years ago. I'd like to think that the teaching that I did was part of my legacy, but a much, much more important legacy would be to bequeath a world in which we're taking action to preserve life on this planet for future generations. And divestment is one step toward that legacy. So thank you. Issue that a lot of us care deeply about, and there aren't easy answers. You know, as Tom Sanzillo said, I don't envy you your position here, but I appreciate it. I appreciate what you're doing. And I think climate change requires us to take bold action. You know, we all know this stuff that I said is coming, and we're all afraid of it, and we're all wish it would go away magically. But I think it requires some hard decisions for all of us, including Maria.
Thank you for being here.
Thank you very much.
So committee, I'm hopeful that floor won't be too lengthy. We're going to be hearing an update about some of the technical difficulties that we experienced from Secretary Naylor this afternoon. And I'm hoping we'll have a little bit of time to talk about the testimony we heard today and next steps on this and some of the other work we have ahead of us this afternoon after the floor. So we